welcome to everybody who's watching this, and I'm very pleased today that I'm having a discussion with Merilyn Moos, who's written you only see it obviously in reverse, but who's written a lovely little memoir about her life called Living with Shadows. And I've known Merilyn for a long time, but there's all sorts of things that I found out in here that I didn't know. And a lot of things that make you think. So I would very much recommend it. And I want to ask Merilyn today some questions about it and about a whole number of things. But firstly, Merilyn, welcome to you. But also if you could just give to people a little bit of background to your parents, who had the most amazing lives, really. I mean, I think they were of that generation, particularly in Germany, who I remember Marlene Dietrich saying at one point that this was, being born at that age in Germany, you witnessed 2 world wars, you witnessed Hitler, obviously, you witnessed all of these things, and they had a very interesting story to tell. So perhaps you could just say a little bit about them and just give people a bit of background.
Okay, I'll start with my father. He was born in 1904 in Munich. And quite amazingly, he told me that he actually witnessed the sailors declaring a Soviet in 1918 on the steps of Munich Town Hall. I mean, that's some history. He joined, all this, there's a certain level of tentativeness about some of what I say, but he joined the Communist Party in 1929, although it could be he belonged to it earlier. He joined in Berlin. He became very active in an organization called the Red Front. That was a product, but a kind of bit of a dissident product of the KPD, of the Communist Party. And as far as I can see, he was kind of the leader of his local anti-Nazi group. He also was a leading figure in agitprop and a leading theoretician about agitprop. He fled on the night of the Reichstag fire. He's only just escaped. Walked his way across Germany, finally reached France many months later, and about a year later came to Britain, and then quite miraculously developed another kind of academic career in Britain. So that's a kind of quick rundown of my father. My mother was born in 1909. She lived in Berlin. She joined the agitprop group that my father directed. That's how they met. She was definitely an anti-Nazi, but not quite as active as my father. And she came out by train. I mean, she didn't expect that she would be arrested if she came out by train. And then she got to Britain before my father via Paris. And by then she was married, but she met a guy here called Brian Gould Verschoy, and then she followed him to the USSR. I mean, the whole story is incredible. And she basically managed to get out by the skin of her teeth. Brian didn't, he was murdered. And I don't think she really ever recovered from the political blows and also the personal tragedies, which I haven't yet mentioned. And then they finally settled down together. And that's briefly their story.
It is an amazing story because it's not, obviously a lot of German left-wingers were in exile, but it seems to me the fact that your father was, active in the Red Front and then escaped, but also that your mum ended up, going to Moscow and all the things that happened there. And obviously that's another incredible thing, because this is one of the terrible fates of that generation. They put so much hope in the Soviet Union and in what was happening there, and weren't aware, I think, even, or lots of them, even at the time she went there, about how bad the situation was, and that must have been a huge sort of political and personal blow to her.
Well, I mean, in fact, what I missed out was, I mean, she came back, she got out and came back disillusioned. And my father had been the secretary of the KPD exile group, but between her experiences in the US, in Moscow, and what was happening to POUM, what the Stalinists were doing to POUM in Spain. In fact, he left the Communist Party in 1937. And my mother, who'd always been a bit more of a fellow traveler, but they both made a complete break with the Communist Party. Neither of them moved towards Trotskyism, though. My mother was more sympathetic than my father. Yeah, I mean, terrible disillusionment, you know.
Yeah. Well, when you refer to the POUM in Spain, and for people who don't know, this was a kind of crucial turning point in the Spanish Revolution, where the Communist Party and their allies attacked the POUM, who were more to the left and who wanted to continue the revolution more deeply, really. And yeah, I think that, I mean, Orwell writes about this, obviously, in Homage to Catalonia, but it must have been another big disillusioning thing for people. And I think Trotskyism remained very, very small for a long period after this. And I suspect for most people, that wasn't an alternative. So they dealt with it in all sorts of personal as well as political ways, which were very difficult for them. So,
right.
So yeah, I think that's an incredible background for you to have. But you weren't aware of all of this when you were growing up. The way that you grew up, you described growing up in Oxford and then in Durham, and that you were an only child, so you didn't have other siblings to say, why are mum and dad doing this, and all the kind of things they might have said. And that must have been quite a challenge for you, because obviously they were political, but in a way it was sort of hidden from you, wasn't it?
Subterranean, yeah.
And so how do you think, when you look back on him, I think it's interesting, you say that your mum used to cook German food, and that you would be given books like B. Traven's books and things like that, and good sort of children's and teenagers books. So obviously that their politics obviously came out in some of these ways, but not in any overt way. And you didn't learn German, you were saying that.
That's right.
And that's I don't know. I mean, do you think that this was deliberate on their part, that they wanted to sort of turn their backs on what had been a fairly terrible experience for them? Or was there some other reason, do you think?
I think there was a double motive. I mean, they were terribly bruised. And I think, they were bruised politically, as you said, and they were bruised personally. And I haven't even gone into everything which actually happened to both of them. And I just think they just needed to retreat to protect themselves. And I think they also had the illusion, and I think it was a mistake, that they were protecting me. I think there was a way in which they thought, we've got to bring up this daughter of ours to be a nice English girl, and therefore to basically leave behind what had I don't like the word trauma, but what had traumatized them. So I think it was a mixture. I think my mother in particular couldn't deal with her grief. She had so many people who had died, been murdered, and I don't think she coped.
And at one point you describe how you had very few relations that you knew, and that was, your parents were exiled, presumably, as you say, a lot of those people died, others of them were exiled. So that must have been strange for them and for you, that they lost a lot of what had been familiar to them.
Absolutely.
In their younger lives. And also for you, this is a void that you haven't got filled, that you don't have lots of family and things like that.
We were this tiny unit. I mean, I think when they lived in Oxford, they probably had more friends. But in Durham, they were just like the three of us, and we really were isolated. And they didn't even actually really like my having friends. I mean, there was a level of paranoia, you know, understandable now, but at the time, you know, it meant my world was incredibly small and rather frightening, really.
Mm. And so when you were growing up, presumably you didn't know so much about what they'd done. So what was it that made you start investigating? I know in recent years you've written a number of things about your parents and about the history of all of this. What made you think about it? Did you think about it when you were young, or was it something that only really kind of came to you later in life? As I think it often does, you don't think about your parents and their motives when you're young, and you're quite selfish about what you want to do and all that kind of thing. And it's only later you sort of start thinking, I wonder why they did that, or what was that about? And then you start investigating.
I mean, I think the first thing was my mother was taken into hospital, and in fact she never came home, but I didn't know that at the beginning. And I seized 2 envelopes, which I'm talking about. I mean, I was, oh, how old was I? I was in my 50s. I mean, old. And there were 2 envelopes which were sitting on what functioned as her desk. And I looked at them, and they obviously were full of letters. And I thought, I'm not going to leave these in an empty house. And then they were written in German, and I had to have them translated because I couldn't speak German, and a lot of them were in really sort of old German handwriting. And that was the first revelation. I mean, you know, that was when I discovered, and, you know, I'd been brought up in a completely non-Jewish context. I mean, totally. And then I discovered that my mother's parents had increasingly seen themselves as Jewish. And in fact, I came across something very recently, how they hadn't brought up their children in a Jewish context, but by the time their first grandchild came along, Ruth, they did, and we're now talking about the kind of, you know, during Nazism, and then they did bring her up more within a kind of Jewish cultural context, so that the effect of Nazism was in fact to intensify their sense of being Jewish. But I didn't have any of that. So that was my first discovery. But I mean, what initially interested me more than my mother was my father. And again, we're talking about me being in my late 50s, early 60s. I started researching my father, and he'd always told me that he wasn't a member of the Communist Party. He wasn't a member of the Communist Party. And then I got hold of the documents from the Bundesarchive. And oh, yes, he was. He wasn't just a member of the Communist Party. He was quite an important member of the Communist Party. And so that all intrigued me. And then I came to write about my father's history, which I have a book about if anyone is interested. Can I show
I'm sure they
it?
will be. Yes, of course. Yes.
Where is it? Here we go. Beaten but not defeated.
Great. Okay, so that's another book that people can get, and we'll put the links to where people can get these books with the interview. So,
yeah.
So hopefully that will be something I would definitely encourage people to read. I haven't read that one, but definitely to read this, because it's so interesting. And it's also, of course, it's not just about your parents, it's about you, and about how life is affected. You know, you talk about you were quite a very tight family unit, and that you didn't have that many friends. And so how did that change? I mean, obviously you've been a political activist all your life, you've been an active trade unionist, you've done all these different things. When and how did you get political, and how did that make you feel about your parents' experience or what you knew at the time?
Well, I thought I was rebelling against my parents because they basically forbade me from being politically active. And I sort of dabbled, I mean, I'm now talking about my teens. I dabbled on the edge of the Labour Party and thought, this is no good. And then I went to university, and it was 1962, and there was the Cuba crisis. And I went out on a demonstration, and I looked around, who should I march with? Because I was by myself. And there was a banner that said, neither Washington nor Moscow. And thus, basically, I joined IS. That was the beginning and really the formative moment in my political development. Yeah, and I went on from there.
So it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, was a big for. I mean, I was still at school, but it was a big thing for our generation. It was, it was the most scary part until we have the present war crisis going on in Ukraine. Right. But so that was the thing that brought you into politics, and then you joined the International Socialist, which was the forerunner of the SWP. And I had this tradition that we're against Washington and what Washington does, but also we don't support the Soviet Union. We don't believe it's a genuine socialist society, and so on. That was the
which was most unusual at the time. I mean, that was incredibly unusual. That was incredibly unusual at the time. Yes,
that's right. So it really stood out for you when you went on the demonstration. So how then did you get more active? I know you were involved in your union for a very long time, and you did all those kind of things. Did you just sort of get involved in different issues and different things that you campaign around?
I was never deeply involved in the internal politics of IS, but I knew what I was doing at work. I mean, you know, I was teaching in an FE college, and I very easily understood that what one has to do is to organize from below, and to organize around of issues, both, if you like, economistic, you know, about pay or conditions, but also to raise political issues. I mean, Vietnam became one of those issues. Ireland was another. And I just basically took to it. And, you know, we had, it was Kilburn, we had a very large, well-organized union branch, which was very active in anti-racism. And I'm proud of it, really.
And of course, when you were active around that, it was much, much more difficult over racism. There wasn't this kind of, at least token acceptance of anti-racism that you That's now right. get in education. Yeah. It was very tough, and it was, you know, teachers and lecturers had to fight very hard for any kind of anti-racist agenda at all.
That's right.
You know, which was, I know was something you were involved in with the, I don't know if you want to say about the Hendon situation.
If you'd like me to.
Yeah, of course. Why don't you? I mean, I know it's not mainly in the book, but it's an interesting little thing, and we can come back to the book in a minute.
Okay. Well, the college I was at had a series of sort of annexes, and one of them was the police cadet college, which was under kind of dual management. It was both under the kind of aegis of the college and of the police. And there was a guy there called John Fernandez, who was Black. And he tried again and again to bring the racism of the police cadets to the attention of the commandant. So he tried to do all the right things and to do it internally. And of course, nothing happened. And then finally, he publicized the police cadets' essays. He put them into the public domain, which again, of course, was much more difficult. This is the early 80s. And all hell broke loose. And basically, he was suspended with a view to dismissal. And then we, ran a rank and file campaign because the union was not keen on defending him, dear Natvi, as it was at the time. And then and then Natvi suspended me and 3 other people because we had broken the rules by going through a rank and file system rather than restricting ourselves to the union bureaucracy. However, we did win, and John was reinstated. It was a fantastic victory because, in a way we were taking on, the state in terms of the police and the educational apparatus and the union bureaucracy. So we won. He was put into a different job, not in the police college, and the 4 of us also won because we had the charges against us dropped. But there was tremendous opposition. In a way, that's really what I have said, but like you just said, there was tremendous opposition to the idea that police cadets could be racist. And then there was opposition to the way in which he'd gone about exposing this. And, did he have a, axe to grind, etc., etc. And I think what we did was help to change the political climate by fighting and winning. Is that clear?
Yeah, it's very clear, and I think I think you're right. It was a sort of turning point. One of, there was Grunwick. There were all sorts of turning points in the 70s and 80s, and the Anti-Nazi League and so on. That really began to change things. And I think it's important, and it's part of this history is so much forgotten, or people suddenly find out bits about it. And yet it's so important as a different narrative from the narrative that there's just been a gradual sort of, it used to be that racism was terrible and now it's all okay, which is the sort of dominant narrative, and there's just these odd aberrations, whereas actually anti-racism has always had to be fought for, and fought for very hard against the establishment and employers and sometimes trade unions. And I think that's always worth remembering. And it's, when you write the memoir like you do, I think it's so important to get some of these ideas across, and I think you do get some of those ideas across.
Just in addition to that, I think the reason why we always carried our branch, even though the union, etc., were gunning for us, and we carried our branch because we had been active militants in our branch, so that the anti-racist struggle wasn't just something which just sort of dropped on us. It was integral to the way that we had been working politically.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important lesson for trade unions generally, for being active in trade unions. But I just wanted to go back more to the memoir. Yeah. I think the whole idea of sort of memory over forgetting, and all the things that we've begun to discover, or people have begun to discover in recent years, about their own families, but also some of the actual history of working class people and of what's gone on. How do you relate to that? Obviously you felt this was something important to write, and as you say, you've written other books which are more directly dealing with the specific subject, but why was it you felt it was so important to write a memoir which talked about your parents, but also the impact on you?
Over the last, 15, 20 years, I've got to know other children of refugees, and too frequently, not always, too frequently, there is a kind of victim mentality. And I've always opposed that. And I've opposed it partly, I think, because I've been unable to oppose it because I've come out of such a proud tradition. I've come out of a tradition of parents who risk their lives, more my father, but also my mother, who risk their lives to try to stop Nazism from taking over. And they did not leave behind their politics. They left behind the Communist Party, but they absolutely stayed on the left. And so I've never seen myself as being a victim. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the memoir was actually, in a sense, to talk about how their past has enriched me. I mean, it may also have damaged me, but that wasn't what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to, yeah, yes.
No, I think that's really important. And one of the things that comes out in the book, and if people buy it and read it, there's a number of illustrations, both of some of the sculptures and things that you've done, but also that your father did, and the statue that they took you to see in Rotterdam when you were a child. So I guess, and you talk about your mother's piano playing, and I guess that one of the things, you know, I always think art plays an important role when sometimes real life is too hard to deal with, you know, the actual history and the experience. If you look at the Palestinians, you know, you look at the poetry and you look at the way that people deal with it politically, but they also express their feelings in art. And
yes.
Maybe that's with your parents, that's one
yes.
of the ways that still stayed with them in a way
yes.
that the direct political involvement didn't, you know.
Yes, I mean, what my father did in Durham was, in addition to his university job, he went off and taught miners and shipbuilders in the WEA. So the way that he kept his own sense of his politics alive was by teaching basically Marxist political economy. So yeah, but I mean, he painted virtually till the day he died. Yeah.
And when you were political and when you had your son, you also said that they then became a bit more overtly political and went on the odd demonstration and so on, which obviously that must have brought back to them a very different period of political activity.
I think I say it in the book. I think they were frightened of what what agents of the Communist Party could do to them. I mean, I think in addition to the, if you like, the fear and the anxiety that they'd absorbed through their flight, because of my mother's adventures in Moscow, I think they were always aware that it wasn't just the British state that might be onto them, but the Communist Party. So that for them to go on a demonstration was an amazing breakthrough. I mean, but it's also a sign of the times, that the Cold War was subsiding, that the left was growing, that they felt therefore a little bit safer. And of course, you know, in effect, I encouraged them, even though that wasn't my intention. I think that probably was my effect.
I think that shows the sort of intergenerational thing really well, actually, that people start, you know, people maybe for a whole range of reasons are political when they're young, and then maybe they have all sorts of things that happen in their lives. They have families, there's all sorts of other priorities that they have. And then sometimes later on what their children do can change them. And perhaps just to end, I mean, I know that you talk about your son who's involved in, I think, environmental campaigning, and obviously you're supportive of that. So just I don't know whether you want to say a little bit about that, or what you think, you know, how you feel about political campaigning now after a long life of having been involved in it.
I think at the moment things look bleak. And although I 100% support environmental campaigns, you know, etc., there's no strong left organization to kind of, you know, act as a guide and a memory. I mean, I sound like a Leninist saying that, but that is actually what I think. I mean, I'm very proud of my son, and I hope that he continues the struggle. And of course, the environment has at last actually become part, you know, of the kind of a much greater political, thank goodness, a much greater political consciousness, a much greater political campaigning. But I mean, I don't think the world is going to be saved just as a result of environmental campaigning. I think we need to campaign as socialists as well.
Okay, well, Merilyn, I think that's a good point to which to end it. And just to say thank you so much for doing the interview. And I definitely, again, can I recommend people to get this book? It is really, really interesting. It's a very, very good read. It's got lots of things in it that I haven't covered in this interview, but it's it definitely is something that you'll learn a lot from. So definitely recommend this one as something that you can all get a great deal out of. So thanks very much again, Merilyn. And
thank you for interviewing me.
Okay.